Welcome back to the A Trek Within podcast. I'm your host, Rob Sullivan, and today I have a special guest, Chris Jordan. He is the host of the Curious Realm podcast, covers science, technology, history, culture, ancient civilizations, futuristic technologies, and even a little dabbling into conspiracy theories. Today, we're going to spend time talking about some of the UFO things that are in the news, which are pretty interesting. And also, we will likely get into Chris's work as a composer. He does a lot of meditation music. So, with that, Chris, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me today, Rob.
Yeah. Well, let's start at the beginning. I'm always curious how people got into all this.
Mine began years and years ago, and I guess really my journey into the esoteric and paranormal began with an actual experience that I had in high school. That ultimately led to me entering the Catholic seminary for a year, and going into youth ministry, all kinds of things. I had what I would consider to be a moment where I was bilocated between the church that I was presently serving in and some blissful world. It was absolutely amazing. I remember talking with Father John Upton after Mass, and he was probably the first one that I'd ever shared the experience with. Like it was directly after Mass. I didn't tell any of the other servers that it happened. But when I went to him with it and explained it to him, he was floored and flabbergasted. Um, and told me that I should pursue that. He was like, I wish that would happen to me. I wish I would have an experience like that. And that led me once again to explore entering the seminary at that point.
That's amazing.
That's what
So,
I knew to be right.
yeah. Well, tell me about that experience. I'm really curious, like how it started, what happened. Walk me
Oh
through.
yeah. Oh well, it was very much I was there kneeling with the rest of the servers. And when I opened my eyes, I was still in the church, but surrounded by an orange light that was all consuming everything, um, almost like a filter between uh, myself and the rest of the church and the assembly that was there. Everything kind of sounded as though it was coming through water, something like that, and I was just filled with an immense overjoyous abundance of love, and surrounded with what I would come to know as uh my connection to the universe, whether you want to call it God or not, or I don't even want to put that on it for other people, because I don't want them to think that they have to be in a church in order to have this experience, Rob. I've had the experience on top of a mountain. I've had the experience outside of church. It was just once again what I came to know as my connection to the universe, that ultimate feeling of love and togetherness, and it was beautifully moving. um yeah, a fascinating and stealing experience in my life, to say the least.
It sounds spectacular. You had mentioned there was a bilocating aspect to it. Talk about that.
Well, and that's why I consider it a bilocation. Just the fact of there was something else there. I don't know. I assume the fact that I was still physically there. Nobody was like, "Hey, Chris, where'd you go?" You know, after mass, uh, and yeah, to me, it was just a fact of I was in my familiar place of church, but I was also somewhere else. I was in a place that I've I've searched for ever since, and once again, that feeling ever since. I've had it quite a few times in my life, but never to the extent of what I would consider that bilocative experience, where a filter was put between me and reality. It was very, very interesting, and at a young age. I mean, I turned 18 5 6 days after I was in the seminary. I graduated high school slightly early, so yeah, it was very interesting, and a beautiful year of my life. There were a lot of trials, tribulations that went on during it, and uh ended up, not staying in. I don't wear a collar now. I'm married with a kid. Counseled and talked with numerous people who now wear collars, about going into the seminary. And yeah, it was definitely something that pushed me to understand that there was a greater connection with the world and the universe around me than what I was seeing. And it brought me to a want of not only understanding that, but searching that out and
Hmm.
understanding, because it was strange to me whenever I went to the seminary and told a couple of few other seminarians what had happened to me. And that didn't happen to you, like what was your calling moment, and yeah, to get strange looks from people, things like that. So that was really my first experience with um sharing what I considered to be a hugely, hugely, deeply spiritual moment, and having people look at me like, okay, that's weird.
Interesting. So I'm curious if you're open to talking about it. I'd
Oh,
be curious
sure.
about your journey and your decision. After the year, to say, you know what, this is, glad I did it, but
Yeah.
not where I want to go.
Well, it is not an easy life. It's a very long road to hoe, becoming a Catholic priest. It's, if you're going for a diocesan priesthood, you're looking at least 9 years, from the point of entry. If you are undergraduate,
Wow.
coming in as a freshman in college, you're looking at least 9 to 10 years. If you're going for a novitiate of Jesuits or something like that, 10 to 15 or 12 to 15, typically, if you're going for an ordered priesthood. By the time you come out, you'll have a master's in divinity and something else. But it was just the fact of, um, it there were some things that I considered in the community, that I considered slightly devious. They let backbiting happen, infighting, that kind of stuff. They almost to the point of encouragement. Um, and it wasn't till I worked in the church. Like, I'd been an altar server for many, many years, entered the seminary, left the seminary, then ended up working in a church a couple years later, teaching music and religion to 4, 5, and 6 year olds, then becoming assistant youth minister. During that time, for about 10 years after the seminary, I taught seventh, 11th, and senior in high school, taught adults RCIA, things like that. So I was always involved in my church, but it wasn't until I started teaching, attending meetings that weren't just youth meetings, stuff like that, and especially being a paid member of the church, that I saw, how people talked about the priest behind his back. And it's one of those, if you can't eat breakfast with that person, eat lunch with that person, eat dinner with that person, if you can't attend mass with them on the daily and morning prayer and evening prayer, and deal with them talking about you behind your back, my God, how are you going to be their boss?
Yeah.
So at 17, 18 years old, yes, I saw that very confrontationally. um as an adult, many years later, it was like, okay, I kind of see the wisdom in the fact, because it is very much a spiritual boot camp. When you come out, you have been trained to task. And it's one of those things that they tell you from the very beginning, that you are being watched and you are being groomed for a very specific position. They have seen your skills, they have seen your talents, they've talked to people from throughout your life, from your church, family, things like that. You go through a pretty rigorous psychological testing going into the Catholic seminary. Actually, it's a 3 day long psychological exam, um, including Minnesota multiphasical, things like that. So it is not lightly considered whenever somebody's like, I think I'd like to be a Catholic priest.
Yeah.
There are quite a few hoops that you go through, and then you're going through regular psychological exam. You're going through weekly formation direction with a formation director. You're going through bi-monthly spiritual direction with the spiritual director. So it is very, very much a spiritual boot camp, and the tearing down of who you are and a spiritual rebuilding. And if you are not prepared for that, it can it can really get you. Much like going thinking like, hey, I'm gonna have fun and go into the army with my
Yeah.
buddy. You
Yeah.
know, no, no, no. Boot camp is a little bit harder, buddy. So yeah, it was very much that, and I look at it now as my training and all of that, my time in the seminary, all of that, Rob, was very much this is my ministry now. My ministry is helping people bridge that gap of understanding of something greater in the universe, understanding the fact that they are tied to the vibration of the universe, that they are part of the universe. And
Interesting.
it's interesting to be able to break that down for folk in a different way, you
No
know.
doubt. Yeah, I was particularly curious because
Sure.
my uncle had been in the seminary, and he also left after about a year.
Not
Not
not many. Not many stay in. I can tell you right now, I entered my freshman class was 33. It was a big freshman class. Um, one one man out of that class wears a collar.
Wow, that's amazing. Yeah, well,
So,
I remember my dad telling me that what had happened because my uncle died when I was around 7, but I
mm,
remember him telling me that, uh, that when he entered the seminary, they basically said, doors open, if you decide this isn't for you, no
yeah,
questions asked, just,
yeah,
go. And then, and he decided he was going to, leave. And he was, my uncle, from what I understand, he was like, captain of the basketball team, he was one of these
yeah.
people that everybody loved. I mean, when he died, there was a line for several blocks to get into the funeral home.
Viewing, yeah,
And it was, and when he decided to leave, the head at the seminary actually sat him down and said, this is going to catch a lot of people by surprise. And ordinarily we don't do this, but I need to know why you chose to leave, or
yeah,
why you're making that decision. And he said, as I'm paraphrasing, but the basic idea was, he said, you expect me to be all things to all people, but you won't let me read the New York Times. You expect me to counsel married couples, but you won't let me interact with women. He's
yeah.
like, I can't do that. This doesn't make sense. Was
Well, and
basically, how he felt about it.
yeah, yeah, and I mean, I'm a fourth degree Knight of Columbus. Once again, I've been assistant youth minister for years and years. I call myself a recovering Catholic now. I still associate myself with Catholicism because that is my base, that is my foundation. And I still talk to my God on a daily basis, Rob. But it is definitely one of those it was another spiritual experience many years later that led to my fork in the road of separation from the church. And that was actively being grabbed by a shadow person in my mother's house. And granted, as happens with many people who leave the seminary, addiction set into my life at one point. um yeah, was a large binge drinker for a long time, until I realized that, I had not abandoned a call, despite my work things. And that's what's interesting, is that you really do kind of go through this failure aspect in life. Many people who leave the seminary go through it. Not a lot of people realize that the actual mental and emotional anguish that you go through after leaving. you know um it's it can be crushing to a
Yeah.
lot of people, and it almost was for me, to the point that, yeah, I started using drugs and drinking very, very heavily to mask that, to try and kill that, and to try and disconnect myself from the empathic nature of that spiritual connection.
Well, thank you for opening up about that, because
Yeah,
that level of empathy is, I remember I was talking to a psychic one time, and she was telling me that she used to do these cruises where she would, bring a bunch of people together who wanted to develop some of those abilities. And people used to say to her, like, oh, that must be so fun to have all those, psychic people on the cruise. And she said, actually, it's not. She said, because they are very empathic and they are very open. And as a result, they tend on the angry side in many cases. And she said it can be very difficult for people
Yeah.
because you do, you can. I don't want to go too far down that road, but
Oh, no,
there's
no.
the negative energy is
Yeah.
stronger than the positive, and that's not a glass is half empty sort of
No,
thing. It's just a simple
absolutely
fact.
not.
Yeah,
And
if you think about the worst thing that could ever happen to you, it's always going to outweigh the best thing that could ever possibly happen to you from a emotional weight scale.
yeah,
And so, yeah, that would be tough. So I'm curious. Now, I got to ask about the shadow person, and then we can
sure.
move in. And then I
Yeah,
want to hear about your transition and interest in the aerial phenomenon
sure
thing.
thing.
Yeah.
Well,
So, yeah.
the shadow person, once again, and years later, looking at it, after, especially after examining the phenomena of shadow people, other things, whether it was a shadow person or whether it was the darker side of me trying to hold on when I was trying to release that and come, I was getting ready to move and leave a lot of stuff behind, change a lot of things in my life. So whether it was the preternatural um kind of darker side of me wanting to hold on, or whether it was because it was a full-on sleep paralysis situation. I had suffered sleep paralysis numerous times before that, still suffer it here and there now. But during a moment of sleep paralysis, a shadow person at the end of my bed grabbed hold of my ankle and began to climb on top of me. um I was able to finally speak and come to fully, and things disappeared. But it was a very, very physical situation. Like I felt hand grasp my flesh and walk up my torso. And when I went to my spiritual director, even after leaving the seminary, I maintained a spiritual director for years and years. Um, and when I went to my spiritual director with that, he was like, "Chris, we really don't have a teaching on that." Um, and I was like, "But I've got the rite of exorcism. I've got the catechism. You know, we talk about the dark things stalking our soul. All, like, what do you mean we don't have a teaching on this?" I was like, I'm having a real problem and a crisis of conscience right now, trying to bridge the gap between wanting me to believe based upon spectral evidence and faith, and when provided evidence of the spectral, we have no faith in it. Um, that's a leap of logic that I don't know if I can bear anymore, um, despite my faith. So that led a lot to my personal schism with the church and issues with the church and why I don't go. I still study. I still study tons of spirituality, religion. But yeah, it's one of those I don't know that I need to necessarily step into an edifice with other people of like belief to experience a true connection with my divine. I do that daily.
Yeah,
So,
I agree with you 100%. Yeah, and there's yeah,
and there are many people
it's
that
right.
that does not work for, Rob,
Yeah,
you know?
exactly. And I heard one time, and I like this idea that religion, no matter what religion you choose to follow, it serves people at different levels of spiritual development. And
Yeah.
if that's something, if going to a church and being surrounded by people of like mind is something that helps you connect, great.
Go,
Nothing wrong
go.
with it at all.
Find the church that is good for you and go
Yeah, if
all
standing
day.
on a mountain by yourself is a better way to connect, then that's probably what you should be doing.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
If watching a bobber bob in the water waiting for something to hit is what brings you connection. Go fishing, man. You
Yeah.
know, like
Just catch and
it
release.
yeah, yeah, and that's just it. It's the idea of what vibration are you willing to live at on the daily? And at what point are you willing to remove your level of consent from negativity and negative vibration? Um and that's a lot of what the work of my music and things like that are is trying to get people to a point of vibrating differently, you
Yeah.
know?
Well, let's talk about the music,
Sure.
and then we'll move into the UFO stuff because I
Yeah,
definitely want to hear about that. Yeah.
absolutely.
So yeah, I can see the keyboard in the background. So that's I imagine been a big part of who you are for a while as well.
Yeah, I've made, electronic music for probably a good 20 years of my life now. Oh
Wow.
god, more than that. God, almost 30. Um, wow, that just hit me. Um,
I
but
thought you
it's
had like one of those time missing experiences there for a
yeah.
second.
Well, and I mean, a lot of my music, especially my music using frequencies, things like that, began in a totally different right. It was when I first began using frequencies, things like that in my music, it was not for therapeutic use. It was for enhancement, and experience enhancement specifically. When I was in college, shortly after leaving the seminary, I got very deep into subliminal psychology and abnormal psychology, and through that found the work of uh, the Linsfield uh, Institute as well as the Monroe Institute. The Monroe Institute being the people who mainly pioneered the technology of binaural beats. But when I found these things, I found a whole realm of frequencies that uh, make people feel different things because of the vibration level. One of them being like 19 hertz. That is specifically a range of vibration. Your human hearing is 20 to, if you look at headphones, you'll see 20 Hz to 20 kHz. So 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz. So 19 hertz is one cycle lower than the range of human hearing. So it's the beginning of ranges that you feel instead of hear, subsonic, things like that, and ultrasonic, that kind of stuff. So yeah, when you start getting into that, it's 19 hertz is where the water in the human eye begins to vibrate and visual hallucinations start. It's also a frequency connected with the paranormal and the feeling of something else being in the room with you, things like that. So I found this range of frequencies in that world and started using them with my esoteric uh, and experimental avant garde music. I was doing a lot of pieces at the time that were representative of the book of Revelation, things like that. So I would put these things real low in the mix where you could barely hear them. If you silenced everything, you'd barely be able to hear it. And waited to see people's responses when they listened, as the artist. So
How does that compare to like? I remember there was a place down when I lived in Chicago back in the early '90s. There's a place down the block from my house that had sound beds that mimicked
yeah,
the vibration of dolphins. How does that compare? In terms of the hertz.
very, very similar, very similar. And what that is basically the idea of frequency entrainment, Rob. When you're talking hertz, specifically with science, a hertz, hertz, is is a cycle per second. So if something, let's say, like the incandescent bulb in your house, or a fluorescent. I'm sorry, I don't know why there's an alarm on my phone, um, but like a fluorescent light tube, for instance, your old television is 60 cycles per second. Your new television is 60. HD is 60 hertz. Your old TV is 30 hertz, which is closer to what your eye actually sees at. The human eye is between 24 and 30 hertz. which is why animation and film used to be at that rate. Um,
Interesting.
yeah,
Yeah. Where did, yeah, because I was just thinking about, for whatever reason, my friend Svenja was telling me that she can hear electricity. She has to unplug things in her house.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I can hear, like, especially if a capacitor starts going bad in something, things like that. You can start hearing a very high pitched whine. If things are on a dimmer switch, specifically, I can hear fluorescent tubes that are on dimmer switches, things like that. That's just years and years of highly trained ears. But yes, there are some people that are very, very particularly sensitive to high ranges of sound,
Yeah.
things like that, Rob. And when you start looking specifically at the subliminal nature of those, which is where the real sound therapy that you're talking about comes in, um, our brain wants to fall into patterns. It wants to use patterns. That we spend most of our life in a state of rote hypnosis, you know. If you drive to work, things like that on a daily basis, you're only aware of that drive a good 30-40% of the time. The rest of the time you are in a hypnotic state. It's why suddenly you're like, "Oh my god, I'm at my exit already." Uh, you're thinking about other things. Once you have learned how to walk, you no longer have to think, "Oh, let me get up and go to the fridge and get something." You just think, "I'm thirsty," and you get up and start walking.
Yeah.
So our brain wants to be in these states, and it's pretty fascinating to see that when exposed to things. And we know this stuff works because there are laws against subliminal messages. They used to pop a drink Coke frame, one frame out of 30 during Let's Go Out to the Lobby. So like we know this technology works. And
Exactly.
it's pretty interesting to see that, like, we have laws against that.
Yeah.
We have laws against subliminally influencing people towards something.
Well,
However, when you're
yeah.
talking the sound therapy, there are two main schools, and one of them is the immersion therapy concept. The idea very much of chakral meditation, same thing as light therapy, because each musical note also has a color. Color and light are the same thing. It's just a vibration. So to expose somebody to a blue light for a certain amount of time can have different effects on the body. To expose somebody to 528 hertz, the frequency of the crown chakra, can yes, eventually your brain will lock in on that. And much it's the principle is called entrainment. The great example, I don't know if you're a fan of Mythbusters, but they did an episode years ago where the pendulum experiment in physics, where if you take two pendulums and swing them opposite ways, eventually they sync up, and then they'll fall out of sync and then sync up again, kind of like your blinker and the blinker of the car in front of you. you know and it's fascinating because our brains do the same thing. If you walk down I could walk down the hall with my wife, who is a foot shorter than me, but eventually our steps will lock together and then fall apart again. So that is pretty well the way that immersion therapy and frequency therapy works. Whenever you're using a singing bowl, for instance, um, your that vibration is penetrating through you, your ear is hearing it, and eventually your brain will lock into that frequency and begin generating that. Now, binaural beats, on the other hand, is opposed that's kind of like going to the spa, you know. Binaural beats is the same principle, except you're much more taking your brain to the gym by the fact that instead of training your brain like frequency therapy trains your brain to respond to a frequency when heard. So eventually, yes, you will key into that 500. The more you use that bowl, the faster you'll fall into 528 hertz, you know? However, binaural beats is like taking your brain to the gym and teaching it to generate 528 hertz. So instead of actively giving your brain the frequency, you're giving your brain two offset frequencies whose sum is 528. So what your brain hears is a perceptible wobble between the left and right ear that eventually it goes, wow, this is a lot of information to process. It would be much easier if I summed these two together and just created this note. So it actively trains your brain to begin to make the frequency when it needs to make it. And it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, that is interesting. It reminds me of another place that was down the block from the same apartment. It was a place in Chicago called Space Time Tanks. Unfortunately, it's not there anymore. But they also had, in addition to the sensory deprivation tanks and the
Yeah.
other things, they had the light sound machine with the flashing lights and the thing. And I remember I would go
Yep.
there and do it. I actually bought a couple of them later on, but I would do it where, yeah,
One
you
of
got
these right here.
amazing. And I remember like I could go like on a Friday, I'd come back from work. I was working in an ad agency at the time. Yeah. And you program it. I loved how you could program different things. And like, so you could do the delta waves or the theta
Yeah.
waves. Like if I needed an idea, I would do the 20-minute thing and
Yep.
I would invariably wake up with an idea. If I
And
needed like, on a Friday, I think it was like a 40-minute, 20 to 40-minute thing. I don't remember where
yeah.
whatever it was something that I could be absolutely exhausted when I got home from work. I could do this thing for 20 minutes and I was good till 4 in the morning.
Yeah.
I was wide awake.
Yeah. No, that was the device I just held up, the Voyager XL. I got this at a pawn shop years ago when I was like 19 years old.
That
Um,
looks like one of the ones I had. That's
but
cool.
this was available at Sharper Image in the
Yeah.
90s. And it was like $400, something like that. But it had the cool thing on the bottom where you could like plug in your own Walkman because it came with a set of tapes. So you could listen to like tape 28, side B. And that was like, 30 minutes to quit smoking. So like you'd go into the catalog and dial in, like 28B, and it would play the binaural beats that synced up with that hypnosis tape. So there would be things, like be a smarter student, stuff like that. But one of them was the 20-minute power nap, where it was the equivalent of a full sleep cycle of 3.5 hours in 20 minutes. And yeah, man, that, oh my God, during college, that was a game changer. Game
For
changer.
sure. I remember too that there was one of them, and I don't remember if it was the 20-minute one or another one, but I love the way that the lights synced up at the end, and it literally felt like it went from feeling like you were, had your eyes shut and you're going down the highway and the lights were coming at you, to all of a sudden it just felt like the room got enormous.
Yeah.
And it was, it was my favorite part of the thing, and I always knew it was like, okay, enjoy this because in about 4 minutes it's going to shut off, and then you're just going to be, there. But it
Yeah.
was just this total immersion. It was amazing. I
And
love those things.
it's really fascinating. Like there has been a whole rebirth in this industry, Rob. And once again in the 90s, there was a big move toward it. And it's been interesting to see it kind of wane and then come back with full force. There's a company that I interviewed at CES last year called Neurovisor, that has one that's a great experience, fantastic. There are numerous programs out there now. One of my favorites is actually the Muse headset, which is used to monitor your brain waves,
Interesting.
which is really cool. So yeah, you can actively like get real time monitoring of your brain waves and heart rate, and at the same time it gives you meditation things that you go through, where it's like, relax on the beach, and as you're relaxing, if you aren't focusing on your breathing, when you lose focus on your breathing, things like that, and your brain waves start losing sync, you'll start hearing birds chirp, which is your cue to like gently refocus your breathing. The more the birds chirp, the more distracted you are.
Oh, interesting.
So yeah, it actually starts grading you and things like that. Like it'll, as you do progressive sessions, it'll tell you like how much distracted time you had, how much time on target you had, all kinds of things. It's great. It's great. So
It's
to
really
to see this move back into the world of brainwaves and brainwave exploration is really and truly fantastic, because there is it our brain is a hugely plastic machine, and once again, they're to recognize patterns, and unfortunately those patterns can be hijacked. One of the things I talk about regularly on my show is the study that was done by the National Institute of Health during the waning days of the COVID pandemic, about negative news cycles, about the fact that negative news cycles actually cause bruising damage to the hippocampus, which is like the soft glove that surrounds your amygdala. The amygdala is the gland in your brain that is the root of fight or flight and panic. That this is the organelle that kept us alive for millennia as we were avoiding saber-toothed tigers in the dark, things like that. Hugely effective and awesome gland. But man, if being surrounded by negativity all the time damages the gland that protects that and keeps it from becoming activated, that's not even a subliminal thing. At that point, you don't even have to be subliminal to affect somebody's brain. So yeah, it's even the frequency beyond brainwave frequency, the frequency of which you do something, the frequency of which you think about something makes a huge difference, Rob. Huge difference.
Yeah, no, I do believe that. And the happiest moments of my life are those periods, and they're pretty frequent when I'm not watching the news.
Yeah,
Not, just because the way I look at it is if something life threatening or seriously important is going to happen, one of my friends will tell me or post it on
yeah,
Facebook.
yeah. Yeah,
I don't sit there and watch it.
yeah, there will be major announcements. You don't have to be tied to social media for that to happen.
Yeah, because it's just too, I always ask myself a question: is any of this actionable? Is there anything I can
Yeah,
do about any of
yeah,
this? And the answer almost always is no. And so,
that's right.
like, better off thinking and doing something, thinking about other stuff and doing other things.
Oh
Uh,
yeah, yeah.
yeah, for sure. So, all right, now we got to ask because I love the some of the episodes of your podcast that I watched and the background that I read. You have also a very big interest in UFO phenomenon and the studying of it, evidence versus data. Let's start there because I thought that was a really interesting distinction.
Sure
Uh,
thing. Well,
yeah,
evidence versus data is a big one for me. Whether it comes to UFO, UAP, whether it comes to even parapsychological research and paranormal research, Rob, um, data is what we have. Um, Evidence, as I say on my show regularly, evidence is what should exonerate you in court. Never let it be less than that. It should be like the lock solid data that you can hand over to your lawyer and be like, this will exonerate me. This is beyond unequivocal. You know. Um, Aside from that, we have data, because it takes years of theorem and hypothesis and testing and rehypothesis to come to a point of an answer in science. And unfortunately, there's been a lot of people who don't like the change from UFO to UAP, and we can kind of start there because I'm a big fan of it. Mainly because UAP allows it to come into the backyard of science. We have for too long called things evidence that are not evidence. When you do that, science kind of disregards you pretty rapidly, because you're jumping the gun, you're jumping the shark hard to come out of a night of investigation and say, I have rock solid evidence. Has it passed peer review? Have we looked at other exonerating factors that may be there? The example I regularly give is the red circles that you see in a lot of paranormal pictures, things like that, where somebody circles something. And it's like I'm a fan of the red circle because that gives us known quantitative. And when you're talking science and data, things like that, that is what we're trying to do, is get down to just the phenomena. to examine. And when you're trying to do that, that means you have to be able to cull the data. You have to be able to go through and say, this is known quantitative. This is known quantitative. So the more red circles we have that we can prove what's in the red circle, that means the greater field of known quantitative we have. And the faster we can exclude a known quantitative or say it is the actual phenomena, you know? And when it comes to paranormal investigation, once again, UFOs, cryptids doesn't really matter. It's the fact of it begins with experience, Rob. The scientific method begins with experience and observation. So if you're at my experience, the question is, do you follow that with the science next? Do you start gathering more data, which is the next step? Gathering more data on the topic. Then from there, going through hypothesis because of the experience versus the data. You know, so yeah, whether or not you've jumped on the train of science or not, the moment you've had an experience or a sighting, the science has begun. And the question is, if you have a picture, it's really only worth 1,000 words to people who have experienced a similar picture. If you show a picture of a wedding reception to a 4-year-old that's never been to a wedding, you're going to have some explaining to do.
Yeah.
As far as what that picture is, because it's outside of their realm of experience, you know? So even for science, it's the fact of you need the 1,000 words to go with the picture. You need the data that goes with the picture. And I'll pop up a quick video that I have real quick, actually, because it's a great example, and I'll narrate it for those who may just be listening. Um, let me. So here it is. What you're seeing is a bright circular orb, various colors, pulsating in color, black in the middle, a very bright ring around it, moving down slowly across your screen from the top left corner to the bottom right. Um, Now, granted, Rob, if I took this image in and of itself and just posted it on a group, zero data, just the fact of I recorded this in my backyard last night, um, I'd probably get a lot of responses, you know? Given zero data, that could be one of 1,000 things. Now, given the data of I recorded this in my backyard in May of 2023, 8 p.m., facing southeast at 8:30 p.m. at this, and I recorded it at this angle from the ground, it would be pretty easy to tell that that video is the star Sirius, zoomed in a telescope and out of focus. It being out of focus is why you see the big black thing in the middle. That's the reflective mirror of the telescope. And it actively moving is the only natural rotation of the Earth, because the base on the telescope has not been locked into position to follow the star yet. So you're seeing an exaggerated rotation of the Earth by 8 to 10 times because of the size of the telescope. All known quantitatives, but without the data, it suddenly becomes very anomalous. Given the data of where it was, what time I saw it, what the conditions were I saw it in, what the direction was, things like that, it can be pretty easily sussed out. So those are the things that we have to consider in the world of paranormal whenever we are gathering data, whenever we say we're gathering data, whenever we're out on expedition looking for Sasquatch or Nessie, anything like that. We have to be willing to give all of that data behind a picture or video. And if the data isn't there, then you immediately have to call into question the picture or video.
Mm-hmm.
Without the data being there, it could be one of 1,000 things, and if somebody says it could be this, it could be that, it could be that, you have to heavily take those into consideration outside of the realm of it's paranormal or it's the 3 to 5% anomaly, you
Yeah.
know? Um,
Interesting. So, what would be an example of something where, when you first saw it, you were skeptical, and then when you collected the data, you changed your mind?
there have been a few things where yeah, and I'll be honest, one of them is the Patterson Gimlin film of Sasquatch.
Yeah. Oh, interesting.
Because the more I have seen analysis of that, the more in depth the analysis gets, the more stabilized the video gets, things like that. The more detail we get out of it. It's fascinating. Even the fact of like you can look at the recovered footage now that's been cleaned and everything else, and you can clearly see mammary glands on the Sasquatch, things like that were never talked about before, but they're there. And when you start looking at even the best costume at the time, geez, man, Planet of the Apes had just won the friggin' won the award at the Oscars for best makeup, So Planet of the Apes is best we could do.
Yeah.
So the fact that you have something anatomically correct, you have something that has muscle groups moving under skin, moving under fur, things like that is fascinating, you know?
That's
And it's one that as it continues to be analyzed has still yet to be fully debunked, you
Yeah,
know?
that is true. Because if it were a costume, you wouldn't be seeing the muscle movement.
Yeah. Yeah, you wouldn't be seeing things move underneath it. You probably would now, but you wouldn't have then.
Well, yeah, that's a fair point. Because if it were, yeah, I could see
Yeah, you
that.
wouldn't have in like 1964,
Yeah.
when the
And,
film was shot.
and to your point about the mammary glands and stuff too, because I read something about that not too long ago, and remember thinking to myself, if I were going to do an elaborate hoax and create, the most anatomically correct costume that was going to be shot from that distance, I wouldn't
Yeah.
even bother with that, because who's going to
Mm-mm.
see it?
Exactly. That is very, very much a modern film concept, you know? The idea of let's get into gross detail. Back then you were still very much talking a lot of hard makeup effect to get varying layers, things like that, like hard paints, that kind of stuff, to get a lot of detail and effect on something. So
Well, and there are so many stories, of people who have experienced things like that, who are, in many cases, seasoned hunters, and people, who
yeah,
were legitimately terrified.
yeah,
When you hear about a grown man who's telling you that, how freaked out he was. I don't know if you ever listened to Mr. Ballin's podcast, but he's got
hmm
some stories about some of those, and you listen to it and you think, wow, there's no, you wouldn't bother to make it up.
yeah.
Nobody needs,
Well,
why would you make up a story about how you were terrified in the woods?
yeah,
That's
yeah.
not exactly a macho thing to do, I would think.
Yeah, well, and that's just it. When you're talking, especially a lot of the older accounts, things like that. Now, granted, in today's day and age, I think that there may be some vested interest, due to sensationalism, due to shows, due to opportunity to write a book or what have you. But when you're talking about many of the original experiences that happened, Bob Gimlin, things like that. When you're talking about alien abductions like Pascagoula, Betty and Barney Hill, that kind
Yeah,
of stuff. Zero vested interest. I mean, my God, man, Betty and Barney Hill were an interracial couple in the 1960s. Massachusetts or not, New Hampshire or not, as enlightened as they were, that still wasn't something that you went around rabble rousing and something you went around making false reports with or anything like that,
Yeah.
and it's fascinating when you get into those things. Even the Betty and Barney Hill case, the physical evidence that has been pulled from that. That is one that I just did a whole episode on not too long ago with Kathleen Martin, the actual niece of Betty and Barney Hill, who herself is an experiencer and has written a few books. She was one of the people who helped spearhead MUFON's experiencer resource team. And when she was a kid, like before her teens, her aunt, who she was very close to, told her, "Honey, this ever happens to you, you tell nobody. Don't go to it is not worth it in your life to go tell anybody that this happened to you." Because it wasn't worth it for them, you know. All they got was ridicule, everything else. It's not like they got incredible book deals or NBC came to them for a movie of the week deal or something like that, you know. These were claims that, if made publicly back then and even now in many circumstances, can ruin your life.
It's so sad, and the disinformation campaign that's
Yeah.
been around that, which leads me to love to hear your thoughts about the congressional hearing this week with the different witnesses in terms of UAPs, unidentified submersible objects, all that kind of stuff. There's a lot of. I
Yeah.
watched it from start to finish.
Same.
Fascinating.
Same.
Yeah.
And I'm getting ready to watch it all again from start to finish and take all my notes and everything for a part of my episode this upcoming week, talking about it and breaking it down. And it is one of those I've seen a lot in a lot of communities where people are disappointed. And here's the thing, Rob. Um, we are not going to see an alien corpse wheeled out on the floor of Congress. We are not going to see a pile of wreckage wheeled out on the floor of Congress. It's not what's going to happen. I'm sorry to disappoint you folks. Um, Disclosure, big D, comes through legal means. It comes through laws. It comes through sanctioning the purse strings of the people who Michael Grush talked about in the second panel. You know, where he was talking about companies who, when he followed the money and went to the door, they shut the door in his face and said, "You have no business knowing what's behind this door or what we're spending the black budget money on." It comes through controlling those purse strings. And until we find out, because they said numerous times, and it's always it's the non-confirmed statements that you need to pay attention to for those out there that are not in the know, that don't. And once again, we won't see any huge revelations, but what we'll see is tiny little pieces of the puzzle revealed. We'll see tiny facets of the gem polished up a little bit more, bit by bit, because as that happens, more people become interested. People who have been disinterested for years suddenly become interested. When you start hearing, no, there's no recovery program. Well, wait a minute though. Were you part of a recovery program? I can't say I was part of a recovery program. Why can't you? Well, because I signed a document saying I would not say that I was part of that. I wouldn't talk about recovery programs. Well, doesn't that mean that there's a recovery program? I can't tell you that.
Yeah, or the
You
person who
know?
injured as part of the program, and that the government's paying
Yeah.
money for having been injured on the job
Yeah.
during the recovery program that they
Yeah.
can't talk about.
That they can't. Yeah, exactly. And those are the things that you need to pay attention to. Those are the things that, like, many people glaze over in the community, but are huge, huge, momentous moments, because it was just publicly acknowledged that people have been injured in recovery of craft,
Exactly.
that
Well,
people have been injured by this technology.
yeah. Now, the thing that I wasn't fully, that I'm still not really clear on is, I'm sure you probably follow Stephen Greer and some of the things that he does. He's been talking a lot about the whistleblower protections that are in place.
Yeah,
But the way that this congressional hearing went, it sounded like they're not as far along as I thought they were.
they are not hugely far along. What's there for whistleblowers is, um, initial whistleblower status, that kind of stuff. Like when Lou Elizondo first went to Chris Mellon and they wrote the first articles, that would be whistleblower status that is protected. Now, does that mean that somebody is allowed to, because once again, as Lou said, he just wrote a book, he just put one out. When that happens, you have to fill out a whole bunch of DoD documents as far as what you know, what programs you have been read into, what knowledge you have of said programs and of their future, and they will tell you exactly what read in material you're allowed to talk about in that book, you know. So once again, that's through protected whistleblower status. Now, he cannot talk about anything that he signed that piece of paper that said he won't talk about, because if he does, that's no longer whistleblowing. That's getting rid of, that is allowing the leak of sensitive information.
Except when the way Stephen Greer talks about it is, if you're dealing with a program that's already illegal, that's where some of the protections are, and that's what he's trying to cover.
In theory, that is absolutely correct. In theory. Yeah. Now the question is, once again, proving those programs and proving that those programs exist. And one of them, I love the work of Stephen Greer. But the last time I had Kathleen Martin on, it was to respond to his recent statement saying that the Betty and Barney Hill abduction was my labs, a military abduction situation. The fact that they were abducted by the U.S. military and those memories implanted in them. So there are things like that where it's like, okay, that's a whole different realm of evidence and a whole different realm of exposition that you're talking about, and a big sack of taters to stand on the corner with.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And it'd be fascinating to know the truth behind a lot of that, because I do think he's right about a lot of what we think is alien is probably not.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I am of the mind that a good 70 to 80% of what we are seeing in our skies, if not greater, is our technology or that of a friendly or foe, or even unbeknownst technology that's still being researched by deep research folks like Skunkworks, things like that, where it's USAPs, unacknowledged special access programs, things like that. Lot of acronyms thrown around the other day. Even my favorite was the constant use of the trigram, constant use of because of this and other trigrams, which are just alphabet agencies. It's another way to say alphabet agency.
Yeah.
But quite literally, it was revealed that like one of the trigrams is in charge of the recovery program. Whether it be CIA or DOD or what have you, but one of those alphabet agencies, not the military itself.
Well, that was what I got.
U.S. Air Force.
It was because they had passed it along to some of these private companies. That was how they were managing to escape oversight.
Oh, absolutely, and that's just it. They're getting money for special access programs, and then routing some of that money through USAFs, through unacknowledged special access programs. And once again, that's just it. That's how we get a hold of this. That's how we get to the point of disclosure. And what you're seeing right now is very much a public display of explaining to those that are not in the know.
Yeah.
What this is. And the example I give is people like my father who look at it and he's like, oh, what are they talking about little green men up there in Congress for? What are they talking about? It's like, Dad, if you owned a McDonald's, you found out that since 1947, the manager of your McDonald's has been misappropriating up to $150 a week. Now, does it matter if he does a good job? Does it matter more that he's been misappropriating $150 a week since 1947? Actually, since 45, they said, since 45, this money has been moved around in this kind of way. These programs have existed in this kind of shifty way, And it's interesting because when you go back and watch Dwight D. Eisenhower's um, resignation speech, the famous one where he's
Oh yeah.
talking about the powers that be and um, the military industrial complex. You can the part before that is very interesting and very, very revealing because we have to remember he comes from a different generation, and specifically a generation and a type of person who, much like Lou Elizondo, takes his oath to his country very seriously. He will never, ever betray the oath to his country. And what what Eisenhower took an oath for, not only as general and soldier, but as president, was to defend the Constitution and what it stands for. And like he said, like we, in order to win this war, we had to suspend parts of things. We had to move around your constitutional rights. Don't let them keep doing that. Don't let the industrial military complex continue in this way, because if you do, things will go horribly awry. Remember, you're in control, you're in charge of the purse strings. Stop this thing while you can, you know.
Yeah.
And
Listen.
it's gone horribly awry now, to the point that we have things like this where, as they said numerous times, the American people are ready. Why things are still declassified or still classified 25 years down the line that shouldn't be classified, you know?
Or even longer in the case of like Tesla's work.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's very fascinating to see the reaction on all sides to these things. And still very interesting to see the number of people that are not aware of these things. As of I want to say like 5-6 hours of that panel ending, there were only about 160,000 people that had watched it. Rob, 160,000 people. You'd think it'd be like in the millions.
I was going to
No,
say there should be
no.
at least another zero on that, if
Yeah,
not two.
yeah. But within a few hours, it was only 160,000.
Yeah.
You know,
And it was
so
much more interesting than some of the other sort of. I rarely watch congressional panels, but
oh
that
god, yeah.
that was. I watched it from start to finish. I thought it was, I have to hand it to I can't think of her name, Mace or something,
Mm,
Congresswoman from South Carolina.
yeah.
She was great. I like her style. I hope.
There were a lot of very, very bold, very blunt questions about a lot of things, even USOs, underwater submerged objects, even the idea of there being bases possibly underwater. They got into some stuff. They got into some thick stuff, and it's one of those, like, once again, if you are an Ancient Aliens watcher, then yeah, a lot of this stuff that they talked about or hypothesis that they brought up may not be something new to you. But if you are an average person on the street who knows diddly about these topics, man, that's some big and major stuff.
Oh, for sure. Like the
Hugely
submersible
major.
object that they thought was a torpedo that
Yeah.
slowed down and followed them.
Yeah.
Like, wow, that's pretty impressive.
Yeah. And that's just it. That a lot of what they talk about are literally what should be the aha moments.
Yeah.
That I think not enough people are giving credence to. And granted, Lou Elizondo just had a little bit of a kerfuffle with things with a presentation and a picture in his presentation. I don't know if you saw that, Rob.
I don't.
Um,
I wasn't watching it the whole time. I was more listening to it. What happened with the prince?
this was before the actual hearing. He's been out. Lou Elizondo has been out doing a talking series, like a sit down evening with Lou Elizondo, and doing a presentation of stuff. And in that presentation, it was recently revealed by John Greenwald from the Black Vault, that one of the images that he used, specifically one of a quote mothership over the Ukraine, was not. It is an image that was debunked a couple years ago as a chandelier from a hotel ballroom in a window.
To your point about evidence and data.
And you know, it brings up a point. I just did a whole episode on it because it brings up something in the community. You know, even myself, like I did it with my security guy. You know, that I've had on for years. He's a security professional, works with the NSA, all kinds of stuff. You know, and it's like, at what point, like even me with you, Mike. You know, like, at what point do I just so implicitly trust you that I do not go and Google search what you're giving me?
Yeah.
You know, that I don't do my due diligence, that I just trust you so implicitly that I go and hit publish, you know, without doing the research as a host, as a researcher, you know. And it's a pitfall that we can all fall victim to, especially if it's somebody that you've known from the intelligence community for years, somebody that you've worked with for years, and somebody that you trust, you
Yeah.
know. So that's something that like it happened to Lou Elizondo, man. You know, so who's to say it couldn't happen to you or to
That's
me?
embarrassing. Yeah. It's
Like,
like
he is an actual counterintelligence professional. But
I can see the cartoon now. Hey, mom, can I when you move, can I have the mothership above the dining room table?
right. Yeah. But yeah, you know, and that's just it. When we're talking paranormal, when we're talking these things, it's the idea of um how blank slate are you looking at something, Rob? Even the idea of when it comes down to preparation of things. Um are you considering yourself a blank slate, or are you going through and hyping yourself up, watching YouTube videos about the place you're going to investigate, reading stories about other people's experiences? That in and of itself is pretty unscientific,
Yeah.
because you are now putting a full filter between you, the experience, and the data that you gather. You know, and even to take it one step further, when you look at things, especially in the realm of quantum entanglement, in the realm of, and this is normally when I bring up remote viewing, you know, because the first papers on remote viewing and what led to remote viewing was a paper by Hal Puthoff, a laser scientist, about how scientists were possibly adversely affecting their experiments in the lab when they went home and thought about them.
Interesting.
The idea of, while I was sitting in traffic, did I burn my house down because I kept thinking, did I leave my iron on? And I thought it for so long and so hard that my iron turned on and burned my house down. You know? So
Yeah.
in that quantum entanglement kind of way, you may actively be creating, which is a totally different phenomenon
Yeah.
to study in and of itself, you know,
Yeah.
but you may actively be activating phenomena by thinking about it, or something like that, which may not actively be the phenomena that you're trying to get,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah, it's wow. There's so many different rabbit holes we could go down. You know what? I would love. I feel like we've scratched the surface on a whole bunch of topics, and what would be
Sure.
really cool would be, well, for one, it would be interesting. You know, anybody watching, if you made it this far and you've got questions for Chris, type them in, because you know we could have Chris back and do a deeper dive on
Oh,
any of these
absolutely.
topics at all, which would be super fun. Yeah, good. I'm
Yeah.
glad you're open to that. And you know, I want to be respectful of your time this evening. What would be some final thoughts, ways to reach you? Anything that we haven't talked about that you would want people to know about you?
Well, you know, really, it's about it, as I end my show every week, it's the open heart, the open mind that makes the conversation, Rob, and without that, humanity doesn't march forward. Like, we've got to allow Magellans to exist. We've got to encourage Magellans to exist. Somebody who says, like, no, no, the earth isn't flat, it's round. I'm going to sail to the edge and show you. You know, like, we need to encourage those people. We need to encourage scientists to open their heart, open their mind, and remind them that experience and observation is where science begins. That without that, science hadn't even started. So, and at the same time, we as experiencers, we as the photo takers, need to let our want of confirmation go. We, much like any good scientist, have to be willing to, quote, kill our darlings when it comes to a theory or a hypothesis. And when proved otherwise, we need to be willing to move forward and understand that even though the picture that we provided, even though the piece of data that we provided to the data set may have been culled, that culled data represents a data set that now empirically leaves just the phenomena, just the 2 to 3% to study, you know? So we've still, even though we've submitted something that has been dismissed, we've still increased the scientific field and increased the study of these things by submitting it fearlessly. So that would be my takeaway, is that both sides need to be willing to put the bricks of building a wall down and start putting them across the river toward each other to build a bridge.
I love it. I love it. Well, listen, if people are wanting to learn more, I definitely recommend the Curious Realm podcast. Where else could they reach you?
Curiousresearch.org. That is our official um, effort to marry the world of paranormal research and scientific research, and to help paranormal investigators prepare their data. We even wrote the new field observation and encounter log for investigators out in the field that has all kinds of data points, things like we were talking about earlier, time, temperature, date, location, GPS location, things like that, to help provide the 1,000 words for the pictures that you're providing to science, because once you get home with that data, once you get back to camp, you've already started processing it through your filters of belief, through your filters of understanding, things like that. The more raw the data is, the faster you can get it down, the better it is for science. So, it's about preparing ourselves and preparing the world to meet this stuff, Rob.
That's
So,
great. I love it because
yeah,
there's so much to be gained by pursuing it correctly,
that's
and
right.
so much to be lost by going in blindly hoping that what you saw is what you think you
That's
saw.
that's
Yeah.
just it. Curiousresearch.org is where you can pick up the encounter log. That's also where you can purchase binaural beat music, all kinds of things. Our latest album, Experiencer, is actively for experiencers of the third and fourth kind, people who have been abducted or been in close proximity to craft or aliens, to help them release their trauma and PTSD and kind of retie to Schumann resonance, things like that. So, yeah, curiousresearch.org, and you can find us every Tuesday night live on the internet, curiousrealm.com.
I love it. And we will put a link in the comments as well to make it easy for folks. Well, I can't thank you enough for your time. I had no idea exactly where our conversation was going to go. I had a couple of general thoughts, and I love what happened because it was an absolute pleasure to talk to you.
Same. It was more than a pleasure, and I'd love to come on anytime you'll have me, Rob.
Terrific. Thanks, Chris. All right. So thank you again for tuning into yet another episode of the A Trek Within podcast. We will be back with more interviews. We've got a couple coming up with some musicians where we're going to look at their creativity and the role that, how they write songs, and just a different look at, because to me, music is, while it's meditation, there's a spiritual aspect to it. There's a lot there. And the good news is, too, that the two musicians I'm thinking of who are going to come on, they're singer-songwriters. They will also be performing a few songs for us. So stay tuned for that, because you will be seeing that in the next couple of weeks as well. In the meantime, we'll just say to be continued, and thank you for tuning in. It's all about trying to